the members of our last panel, hard. Where food is concerned, when food is involved, either miracles happen or disasters occur. So food is a locus for intimacy, and as a result, lives are changed. Many of you, I'm sure, have already seen the movie Babette's Feast. If you haven't, see it again. You know, it's a perfect example of the spiritual benefits that come from good food.
Thank you to Patrick for making the connection. As I was sitting out there listening for Bill and the review, I thought, why are we here? There's too great a gap between what you all have been focusing on, most importantly, and where we address the issue of food. And then you raised the issue, both you and Shimon raised the issue of thankfulness. And that indeed is the point of connection in many ways, but it's aside from finding spiritual value to, and in fact mandate for things such as environmentalism and conservation, because we were given the earth and we were expected to be good stewards of it. So those movements, those concerns, those focus are absolutely, I believe, God-given. But when I think of food, and I think of it in a context, in a spiritual context, if you will, to me it's embodied in the word hospitality. Because hospitality itself includes or embraces essential virtues of generosity, of thankfulness, of sharing, of kindness and compassion, justice, and ultimately love. So for me, and in the Christian religion, and we have many common roots in terms of our traditions with food, but food has become really an important part of the essence of our religion. It is at the communion table where we partake of the bread, and that we are bound together as a community of faith. And in my mind, there is no bright line between that table, where we share an important unity, to the table we move to afterwards with our family and our friends, and create a different kind of community, but essentially expressive of those same virtues. And I agree with you. From the earliest moment, it's been miracles like manna from heaven, or feeding 5,000, or some say 4, or maybe just a lot of people, with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. So it's a rich spiritual topic.
Mm-hmm. Natan, would you like to speak to that?
Sure. Well, you know, just as I was driving up, I was thinking about something I read this week. Anybody see the New Yorker this week? Mm-hmm. There was an article about food, and it was about this guy, like Silicon Valley guy, who's in his 20s, and he decided that he didn't really have time to eat, and he couldn't really afford it very much, so he's creating this stuff that they're calling Soylent. Remember this?
Soylent Green.
So, exactly. So it's you know, and it became a big hit. It's just like got all these venture capitalists behind it, and he went. You know, he did the research and he figured out what are the essential things that we need, what are the nutrients that we need, and you know, he ordered them online, got a bunch of powder, mixed it with water, and this is what he's living on. And now he's marketing it, and it's doing great. And so it just reminded me that this is, you know, this is one direction that our culture can be taking, which is to say we can figure, it relates a lot to what Bill was talking about. We can find out all we need to know by breaking things down to their smallest bits and forgetting about any kind of connection to anything, but simply saying, well, that's what we are, biological machines, and we need this kind of input, and this is how I can most efficiently get it, and that way, you know, here we are, food. And my reaction was, you know, first of all, he so much wanted me to be angry, I almost didn't want to be angry with him, because, but it was just such, this is so the opposite of all the things that we're talking about here, and especially the idea, which I think is so central to the Jewish approach to food, which is the Hebrew word kedusha, which is holiness. And that's, you know, so much, the kosher laws Even it's interesting, I know Marvin Harris and all the things talking about the various ecology thing, but what it says in the Torah about why do we have all of these laws, it says so that you should be holy. And when I think about what is holiness, it's a very big question. What is holiness? But one of the things, if you go back to those texts, and you go back to the biblical texts that use the word holiness, it really seems to say, it's like, what is the proper pattern and the proper relationship that God created the world in? This goes back to another famous, I'm so glad you brought up Wendell Berry. Wonderful essay, early essay, called Solving for Pattern, which you should look, because he's talking about how we tend to, in our agriculture, look for one solution to one problem, look at, erase all the other externalities as you're talking about, and just see what's like, okay, how many pounds of beef can we get from these cows, and let's look at them as machines, and we'll put this much amount of corn into them, and then you have all of these huge problems that are like externalities. But in fact, what Wendell Berry is talking about is that, no, in fact, there is a pattern that animal is part of. It's part of the world of the grass and the animals and the people and the community and the air and the sun. All of these things create, in a balance, in a relationship, what we call Kedusha, holiness. And it's the thing that, the mistake that these folks are doing when they are breaking things down, the term really is reductionism. They're reducing everything to something, and it looks very scientific and it looks very rational. We can, after all, these are the chemicals that we need. But in fact, if you really start looking at it, where does life come from? You can't see it. It's not there. It looks like you could break it down to all these chemicals, but what is that difference between a blob of chemicals and something that we call life, living? You can't put your finger on it. It's what they call emergent. It emerges. And when you break things down, you dissect it, you take away the life. You take away that emergent property that makes it living. And so much about food is it's not in that biological level, it's in that emergent level. So much about food is what we talked about, that meal, the hospitality, the sociability, the joy, that's part of it, the beauty of a farm, and the craftsmanship that goes into that. That is all about putting things together. And the beauty, when you're as the farmers have described, the intricateness, the humility, the constant creativity, and the dialogue back and forth. That is holiness. And in the world we're living in today, we really have these two paths that are competing. And there are a lot of people out there who are just trying to say, let's break it down, let's make it more efficient. And it really is in the direction of not just Soylent Green. Because the more we treat the world as a machine, it's like the Sorcerer's Apprentice. It's like we want to have all that power, but we get caught up in the power, and we become like machines, and so we lose our life. And that's what's happening. And yet there's a lot of these other very encouraging kinds of things that we're seeing, where people are starting to see that, no, it's not just a straight line. We're all in one planet, it's all one big circle, and there really is one sense of, we've got to get back to what is creation, and what are the patterns of creation, and how can we be guardians of Kedusha, guardians of holiness, whether it's in our own garden. That's why I think composting is a spiritual act, because it's the most simple way that you can, in your own backyard, see and experience this incredible miracle of, it's not just here out into the garbage, out into, out of sight and out of mind, but I can see that my food scraps are going back, and then they become part of my garden, and I eat them again, and I actually experience that wholeness and that sense of a pattern, a sense of symmetry, and it really makes the pleasure of eating something holy.
Eating and action. And eating and action could also be referred to in terms of ritual. Eating is a ritual. And certainly in both of your traditions, the eating has ritual connected to it. Could you just speak of maybe just one example?
Christian religion, I think, certainly for all mainstream Christian religions, it is the central act of worship. It is at communion, where we literally, ritually, sacramentally receive bread and wine, that we believe we are united to a sense of the holy, but also to one another. So food is absolutely essential, bread is absolutely essential, and wine, to making, realizing that kind of community. So it's going from food to act is critical. It's at the core of our faith. But the other part that I think we move from the food to the act is in how we share it, so that programs that support food pantries, or it's a different kind of recycling, but it's making sure that what we have we are sharing with others, has an important spiritual context too, and is an action that's related to our recognition of food as an essential bonding element of humanity.
Thank you. Yes. Natan?
Sure. I mean, there's so many ways that first of all, just as Shamu had talked about, one of the things that is an opportunity in Judaism, an opportunity every time you enjoy anything in the world, but especially clearly with food. Anytime you eat food, you say a blessing, and that is the whole. There's a saying in the Talmud that if you enjoy anything of the world without saying a blessing, it's as if you're stealing from God. And it really is that sense that this is it's all a gift. And so there's an opportunity to say a blessing. Every time you eat food, really anytime you smell a beautiful smell, anytime you see a beautiful sight, there's a blessing to say. And the thing about it is, though, is that I talk about blessings, and it's a wonderful thing to do, but it really is only the first step. Because I often say, like, okay, I'm going to eat a food. When I say this blessing, if I'm saying this blessing, which is supposed to be acknowledging that this food is a gift, and then I think about where the food came from. If the food came from a factory farm where they were in fact not treating the earth as a gift, they were not treating their workers in such a way that they acknowledged their dignity as human beings, then that food was produced actually in a non-gift kind of way. It was food produced by stealing from the world. So it's only really the first step to say a blessing on food like that really kind of falls flat. So really it should be that that's the beginning of a process of getting me to think, to next time I get some food, I'm going to try and get it from a place where it was raised or grown as a gift.
Wisdom House as a retreat center, and how very often, at least, and I bet this happens here, that at some meals during the retreat, they are taken in silence for the specific purpose of allowing people to be mindful, intentional about what they are eating. Which for some people it may involve a huge measure of gratitude. It may involve, as Shomu was talking about, humility of understanding you are receiving this great gift, or as the connectedness that you spoke so eloquently about, of all of being part of a whole. But it is when the act of eating taken with all the other extraneous diversions taken away in silence, so you concentrate on the color, on the taste, on the smell, on the shape, and how it got there, and in that context to be thankful and humble.
Thank you for mentioning that, because it's very, very true. A 5-day silent retreat and an 8-day silent retreat, and what's also very interesting to see is at those times when the retreat is finished, people often come and say, I felt such a great sense of community here this week, especially at meals, even though we weren't talking to each other. It just heightened everyone's awareness and even heightened their connectedness. Thank you for mentioning that. In terms of community building, how can we build more mindful communities through our rituals of food?
Ways that we've tried to do it. I love to cook. I'm not a professional cook, but I love to cook. I always say the other side of my brain that works when I'm looking at. I come back from services on Sunday, and sometimes my husband will say, well, let me take you out to lunch, and I'll say, no, I need to chop something. But sometimes I just need to smell something wonderful. In any event, we do a lot with food at our parish, partly because I feel so strongly about the theological concept of radical hospitality, but I think it's trying to lead our congregations, at least for me, in ways that accomplish some of the things that have been talked about today. So, for instance, we were instrumental in starting something called Judea Gardens, which is a community garden that grows vegetables on land donated by a place like Steep Rock, and then that the vegetables are distributed to people who otherwise would go and buy a frozen pizza. And so being understanding, providing a means for people to participate in the process and extend that need. Building community. We've started something called the Parsons Table, where the first Wednesday of every month, I cook lunch. And we invite anybody who wants to come. Any religion, any town in the area, and no agenda, no price, just come and be together, eat and enjoy. And this year during Lent, we recreated a first century meal using only food that we could prove either by reading scripture or through other things, the foods that would have been available. It was very interesting what we couldn't use. Someone said, what about avocados? I said, not on the list. But, and made a first century meal, which we then had, I think we had about 50 or 60 people who came. And we sat in a big open square of tables and talked about what we felt about that food. And then probably the most wonderful thing we did during this, we had a Seder, an interfaith Seder with many friends in our Jewish community coming together and realizing how our traditions for that Seder meal were indistinguishable.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's promoting connections and mindfulness is what I would say.
Thank you.
That's great, yeah. And you sort of mentioned Seder, and I was thinking about that. That's something, this is such a basic thing that has been picked up across, the world, where this basic idea that you have a meal, and this is almost the basic building block in terms of Jewish education. It really starts there. It's like that's the first time you hear about teach your children, tell your children the story. And how do we tell the children the story? Well, you have a meal and you have these foods, and you pick up the food and you say, this is the bread that we have. And that's such an effective way of teaching, because it's so sensual and it's so multidimensional, and you really remember it, the taste and the smell. My elder son is 8, and he hates to go to synagogue, and he doesn't want anything to do with religion, but he loves the holidays, and he loves all the foods, and wherever he's going to go in his life, he's always going to remember those tastes and those smells and the conversations and all those things. So something that has been picked up by so many people now in our generation is having a Seder. It's such a wonderful, wonderful spiritual technology. But, and Jews traditionally do that every week. We have a Shabbat meal, a Sabbath meal, which is all about the enjoyment of the food and creating community. And that is really the center of the Jewish week. In some ways, the center of the Jewish religion. It's the time when you really get to appreciate, Shamu mentioned all these moments of wow. I think it was Anne Lamott wrote a book about prayer, talking about, well, it's basically wow, please, thanks. Something like that. So at least you mentioned 2 of the 3. There was like wow and thanks. And there's also please in there. But in the meal, it's really an opportunity to say wow. And the other thing I also want to mention is, which is coming up in starting this fall, on Rosh Hashanah this year, is going to be starting the Shemitah year, the 7th year when the fields in the land of Israel are supposed to lie fallow, and you're supposed to forgive all debts. And really, there's been a wonderful movement that's been going on in this last year or so of a lot of organizations, Jewish environmental organizations, organizing around consciousness raising about what are we going to do this year in the Shemitah? What are we going to do? In Israel, it's usually in the past has been marked by technical kinds of observance. People either leave their land fallow or they get around it with some kind of a loophole and they sell it to somebody and then they keep farming. But now people are actually really starting to look at how can we take the spirit of the Shemitah, the spirit of the sabbatical year, to say that, you know what, we may be involved in this agriculture, but we are not the owners of the land. The land has its own needs, the land has its rhythms, and we need to actually fit ourselves into those rhythms. And it's with the land, it's with the society, it's with all of these things. We are part of this larger whole, and we need to be responsible for that larger whole.